Hi, morning, everyone. How do you say it in Italy? Buongiorno, Roma. Come
Well,
sta? Um, if you don't speak Italian, Italian, I think it's good morning, Roma. How are you today? And I'm very happy to be here to share with you guys about something familiar with most of us here. If you work with Angular before, but if you don't work with Angular yet, I hope it is still beginner friendly. And hopefully you get something out from the talk today. But let me go to the next one. As Leonardo had mentioned, I'm originally from Vietnam, but been moved to Singapore a couple of years, and the flight from Singapore to Rome took around 17 hours, like, including transiting and also,
quanti
yeah, I
speaker
was only
uno,
sleeping
due.
a bit short yesterday, so
Quant'è?
hopefully the talk
Poi
went well.
vai dal
If there's
ragazzo lì
anything
sulla
wrong,
destra che ti mettiamo
don't
l'archetto.
take it too hard on me.
No,
So that's the two logo you're
non
seeing
appena il
is
prossimo sale.
the two logo from Angular Vietnam and Angular Singapore, which is the two initiative that we started in the two countries to grow and advocate the Angular community in both countries. So that is some of the photo from the previous meetup. Thanks so much. Thank you. And about myself, some of you might have known me, but most of you probably don't know. I built a few kind of open source projects in Angular, which Jira clone is the first one got take off, and then there's the Angular Spotify. So technically, it's just using Angular, the framework, with a lot of cool feature that Simona and Kristen just mentioned, and try to replicate it in a way that is look like a actual application, and you can learn something from it. I hope it's helpful so far. It's got like 2,000 stars, so you wanted to give a bit more, I don't mind. And in Singapore, I work for a company named Ascenda. We build a loyalty platform and make it easier for enterprise and our partner, including bank and airlines, which also why I'm here today. Because Ascenda is big in Angular. Most of our application is using Angular under the hood. And because our partner is like a big bank and airline, so they are very focusing on one aspect, which is accessibility, where I didn't have a lot of experience working with it before joining Ascenda. So let's go back to the talk. We will just revisit the Angular component, the definition, how we do it, and we look into the augmenting native element, which is one of the kind of concept that most of the engineers that I talked to didn't know about. You already know about that, that's great, that's awesome. But more than half of the people that I spoke to, they didn't know. And even my team, when I just joined, I think all of them didn't know about that. And if we have more time, then we look into the power of Angular selector just to revisit and get some sense how you can apply it to the next component that you're building. So, about Angular component. As we already know, the component is the most basic building block in Angular application, and one big Angular application is consisting of a lot of small components that was putting together to render an application. And it's true for other framework. It's not really Angular. It could be for React, for Vue.js, for Svelte. And it's important to do it right. And we look it into a very simple use case of how to just creating a custom button and how our team that's been implementing it and how we can make it better. So we have two. The first two is just very simple, just a text, and you can give it an icon. The last one is a bit tricky because it looked like a button, but you wanted to have a behavior of a link, which technically means you click a button and then it's open a new tab on a browser. So we will look into the implementation, and we started with an easy one, which is going to be something like that when you think about how to build a component. We are going to start with a add component on top, decorator, and then you give in a selector, a share button, and you're going to have a template, and then you are going to have classes to define the behavior of the component that you wanted to build. And in this use case, it's super simple. You just give it two types, either it's primary or secondary, and then you give it a class based on the type. Pretty simple, I would say. And then the text is going to be rendered directly into the UI using the input button text. And that's how you use it. Pretty simple. The back also can see the code, I guess. Good for you. Then when you render it into the browser, that's when Angular is doing a bit differently. Then it's going to render an actual custom DOM element on the UI, like share button. And then whatever content inside go into the button. And it's not yet a problem. It's fine, it's working. And with our simple use case, it's kind of okay. So we move on to the next use case where you wanted to do a bit flexible with a text and an icon. And usually you wanted to give in an HTML kind of code because it's just not a name of the icon. It could be different implementation from a different icon library or something else or an image. So you really wanted to give in a HTML template. And it is not my code. It is some other people's code. But we think of, we can use ng template. And then you can reference it and give it into the component using an input. And it is still working, really. It's work for our use case pretty well. And you can just render it like that. Share button content, give it a hash with a template, and it's going to link together and render it outside. So when you render it out, now it's like still share button on the outside. Inside there's a button component, button element, the native one, and you got the content of the HTML that you pass in. So because you give in the HTML, it's very flexible, which is fine. But if we start to look into the third one, and when it's look into the third one, some of the team members that I talk to, they start to putting a lot of logic into the code, and this was checking if there's a URL and all, and it's just getting really long. Because now the share button is not just doing the rendering a button anymore. It is also taking care of rendering a link. And at the end of the day, what my team member want is really just want to make a link that look like a button, and that's it. All of the functionality is going to be the same. Like you can give it a text, like read more, but then because we have the button implementation, so that's why suddenly there is a e-target blank they introduce, which is equivalent to target, and redirect URL, which is equivalent to href. So all of that is the kind of built-in from the A. But because we've been abstracting away the A tag, so that's why you need to just forward it through your kind of custom component. And when we render now, it's actually rendered an A. I mean, actually, I can show you the code. So that is the one. So the code is taking like 70 lines long, and the template was a bit longer. I think it's 100, I don't know, it's lesser, like 50 lines. But yeah, you can see there's a lot of switch cases is going on. You need to check if it's a button, if it is an A, and if it's an A, is it going to be the one inside? Then we can use a router link, or if not, the one from our application is going to use the href. So quite complicated, I would say, for a very simple component. Like just a button, really. And sometimes for us, we run into the accessibility issue where some of the team member just doesn't read the implementation of the share button at all. And what they think is that because the button is going to render as a button, so why not I'll just put the A outside and then giving the button inside. So it just look like what you want. But the button which is applying is like the one in the middle. Maybe it's not that clear. But because now we have the A and then the share button, and then inside there's a button. So when you press tab on the browser, it is going to focus on the A first with the default kind of outline, and then it's focused. You tap one more time, it is going to focus on the button, which is like you need to press another time to get out of the button. And usually it's fine, right? If you don't really use the keyboard and navigating around, but as engineer, I has been, there's a lot of website has failed me when I use the keyboard to navigate around. And it is not really a big problem if you don't get a requirement for it. But in our use case, in Ascenda, or like in the project that requires a lot of accessibility kind of requirement, it is really a big thing. And this approach, as you can see, is not scaled very well because there's a lot of other kind of attribute that can come with a button or the A. So suddenly, maybe if you need to say, oh, is it going to be a read-only button or is it going to be a disable button, you start to forwarding more and more and introduce more kind of input. And the good thing here is like you are using kind of the same name. But if the team member was a bit nervous and he giving a new name and all, it's gonna create quite a big learning curve and all, because not everyone is gonna look into implementation of the component that we use. We just look into the example, and we don't even have storybook. So yeah, to that. Other than that, there's a global attribute that can come with an A or the button, which is applicable for every single HTML element in general. And the one that we focus on is the area. And you can see that's just a GIF of scrolling over and over. And it just doesn't get a stopping point. Like you just keep scrolling. And if you need to introduce maybe 20 more, what you do? I mean, of course, you are not gonna add like 100 of them into the component. But if, let's say, you need to add more, like 20, so yeah, that's how we do it. I think I'm not the one who only do it. I hope. I hope. So, introducing augmenting native element, which is already mentioning on the Angular.io accessibility guideline. And the augmenting native element, just a second. Like, anyone heard about it? Just wanted to raise your hand. Of course, someone from Angular team, we don't count, but there's just a handful of people, I would say. So my percentage of more than half is still correct, I guess, yeah. So augment in English is not the word that I use every day, really. It's increase something by adding something into it. And we can imagine it is more like the, how to say, like enhance the thing, right? Like enhance or improve with some existing thing. And in the scope of Angular, we thought about, no, not we, in the guideline, it is like utilizing the attribute selector, which is something we don't really talk about when we build a new component, to extend the button element. And that's usually how my friend was reacting, like, is it a thing? I don't believe it. And then they start to look into it, and I think most of the team members, after a while, when they start to know about native attribute selector that can enhance the functionality, they start to enjoy it a little bit better. But of course, the first facial expression is like, what is it? So that is the proposed kind of new stuff. The selector, the most important part, the top one is like, instead of using a share button, we start to use just the button and saying if it comes with an attribute selector. The same goes to the A. We don't freely allow them to use the share button only because we don't want to apply a div with a share button. It could look like a button in general, but when you hover into the div and press enter, nothing is going to happen. So that's why we try to scope it into just a button or the A. And the template here is important because it's NG content, and it's a very complicated subject which we call content projection. And if I got to go back to Rome next year, I'm going to talk about it, but not today. And we look into the capability of the directive selector. We look into directive selection because directive is like a parent of component. So component is like directive with a view. And there's a lot of way that you can select and mesh the component and then apply a certain thing into your component instead of just always introduce new thing or introduce new kind of custom element name. And the one we just mentioned is, that is the square bracket with a share button. and then it's going to match with these attributes, like just select the attribute name. And of course, we need to see the differences. So that is how the two things look a bit different when we start to using the new way to implement. So the one on top is coming with a button class and the text, and the below is only just a share button. And then if you import, that's important. You need to import this module into your application because it's not going to work like before. But then now everything in the button you have access to, which means you don't have to worry about forwarding custom kind of input or introduce new input when you need to. The next one, so the login is here, like the NG content has been projected over. So think about NG content is something that stays between the HTML tag, and then whatever is inside, and you just don't give a name, it is going to be rendered in the NG content kind of slot, I would say. You can give it a name as well, but then we can look into how we can improve it further in a couple of slides. And how it's going to render now, it's just a normal button. But then because we have this attribute directive that matches this kind of button with a share button, so now it has a couple more kind of classes. The second class, the second button is going to be the same. Because now, with like inside the button is what you can access to, so it doesn't really matter. You don't really have to worry about it by introducing new kind of NG template. It's just what it is. And then because you have access to the native element, now you can start to apply more stuff into the button if you want to or if you need to, instead of forwarding stuff. And the last one is interesting because, it's rendered as a button and inside. So it's very similar like the code that you wrote on VS Code, really. So it doesn't introduce new stuff. And the last one is important because the last one is the one that starts to introduce a lot of complexity. And by applying the first kind of tip, we're just using still the A tag, but then apply an attribute selector, so the share button. And whatever inside is still inside. Whatever is the old name, like, okay, we use different things like share button. But whatever is an old name like target, it's still the existing one. So you know about that. You've been using it like 100 times. You don't worry about, is it like an is target blank with equal to Boolean true or something. It's just still the same. And then, sorry. Oh yeah, and the href is not redirect URL, which just, I didn't make it up, it's running on production. So how it's going to render? It's just render as an A, and it's look exactly what we want. Just doesn't really have any different at all. What is the benefit from doing all of that? So we have a familiar API because we have access to all of these native elements. The second one is accessibility win. And this slide, I think I was copying from Jeremy. He was doing kind of similar talk like 6-7 years ago. But yeah, sadly, not really everyone watched this talk. So accessibility win, as mentioned, right? It's like when you use an A and the button, you know what comes with it. So you don't have to worry about what is inside and what might be unnecessarily be rendered into the UI. And that could lead to some problem. And the simple implementation, I think, is obvious. I mean, I can show you guys. Is it here? No, on the other side. So that is the old one, like 50 template line and then 70 TypeScript. V2, I code it V2 and then I just do it in the same thing. So it is like 25 live code. So yeah, for me it's easier. Thank you. And we didn't even talk about that. The import here is breaking down. So yes, of course it's longer. So the key takeaway is that you can utilize the attribute selector so that you can extend the native element. And in the use case, sometimes you can use button with an attribute selector. And it could work better than a share button. And in our use case, it is really work better. And we don't really have to worry about other stuff. It is not something I introduced. I mean, I'm not invented it. That's something come with material. And you have probably seen it when you use material button. So here is do the same thing with a lot of kind of attribute coming along with a button. And then it's going to render, adding a functionality on top of the existing button. The next one is NGROME, so another library in Angular. So yeah, they use the same thing and using pretty similar than what I show you. The same button with NG button and a NG button. So the part that I was mentioned, right? So far we only used NG content. And NG content is technically just project what was existing inside the button. But let's say you wanted to say, oh, we always wanted to show a loading icon on the left side of the text. You can enrich the template even further by saying, yeah, okay, there's always an I inside, and then there's a maybe Boolean that's passing in somehow. Obviously, that depends on your implementation. But the important is you can extend the template. So it's not just a simple NG content anymore. It could be some div around, and then we have been doing it. So the customer were asking for a very tricky button with a lot of gradient and all. And then we need to just using a button, and inside, there's quite a lot of span and all. But yeah, it's working. No one knows it. What else you can do? Obviously, you do better on button, and A is good, but yeah, what else? So, example from material also has the table component, which using the same kind of approach. Or yeah, they also has the math table, which is completely written, I guess. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the math table is going to be doing a bit different than the table with a math table selector. Then there's some other component that can apply as well. So this one is apply on the native HTML element. So, oh, actually, I think I was putting a slide and I was asked the question. So, should we always augmenting the native element? So I think I removed the slide by accident. But the answer is obviously it's not possible, right? We need the custom component. But probably when we start to create a new component, maybe if it's a button, that's obvious. I'm gonna use augmenting all the time. But if the other, maybe a input, like text input or a select, we can think about how we can apply augmenting. Or we use a wrapper component so that you still can access to the native element. And then we don't lose all of the functionality that come with it by default. So the question is always like, can I augment the existing one instead of creating or introducing a new component? And that's it. That's for the first part. I still have time for the second part. Maybe 5 minutes. Thank you. So the second part is more like revisiting, and I didn't really prepare the use case that we use, but then I call it the power of Angular selector. Sound powerful, yeah? So on the custom button number 3, there is very interesting part, which it has a rel no open when there's a target blank. But in the implementation, I didn't specify it in the share, like the button with the share thing. I mean, I can show you again. So in the button v2, we didn't really specify what is this rel thing at all. And we don't also didn't put it into the template. So where does it come from? And we all know when there's the link with target blank, it should come with the rel no open, so it's going to be safer. I mean, most of the browser has been fixed, but we just do it as kind of backward compatibility. So the naive approach is, okay, why I wanted to introduce anti-safe link? Because it is going to do one simple thing, which is apply a hot binding of rels and no open. And then when the thing, I use A with a target blank, then I use this directive. Because for some reason, VS Code doesn't really support the autocomplete of rel equal to no open on my machine or on my friend machine. So when I use this way, anti-safe link, I get auto-suggestion from VS Code. Yeah. But it's introduced kind of new stuff. that might be other people didn't know about. And that's what happened with the custom number 3, because I was using a different approach. And this approach, there's a lot of blog posts that have been written about it. So I didn't invent it, just bring it back so that we all look into. So I call it auto off-in approach, which technically means you, how to say, you make the selector a bit more powerful. And that is the idea. Instead of always introducing new stuff all the time, like anti-safeling and all, now you can say, oh, actually, if there's an A with a target blank, but it doesn't come with a rel, then automatically the directive is going to match this element and start to apply this. Oh, it's just do a simple line here where you kind of apply the host binding. But the selector now is really powerful. You can look into it and apply it without you even notice. And that's what I thought is great. Because sometimes you could forget. That's obviously, you use linting, but I disable ESLint all the time on my local environment. Or we don't run it on CI. So this kind of issue could happen. And if you can build Sapling global directive, and it's using a standalone true flag anyway, so you can import it into the module where you use an A, and then whenever it say that there's a lot of A with the target blank, that doesn't come with this attribute rel, then it just apply this automatically. And the important thing is you need to import it. Yeah, that's important. Maybe Angular can support, like, we can detect it and does import it automatically somehow, but at the moment you need to import it. Maybe I'm just saying that the Angular team can take a look. Then when you use it, it's going to automatically apply the thing, the rel no open. But it is not new. We all know that ng-form is like when you import form module, suddenly, oh, there's the ng-submit event that's coming from nowhere. Or you can use the hash f, then you assign it to an ng-form, and it contains a lot of value, like the object with a valid, or object with a with the error and on. So the Angular team was doing something very similar, which I hope you've seen it. If you don't see it, you need to go through github.com/Angular and then find the line number something, ng-form. Technically, what it's trying to do is say, when you import this module would declaring ng-form directive, and then the selector of the directive is like saying, if the form is not ng-no form, which means there's a way for you to opt out of it if you don't need it, or it is not a form group, which is not a reactive form in general. You don't want to apply this kind of functionality when you have reactive form, or when you use ng-form, the custom thing. So the selector here important because you can use comma to say different selector and still match, and you can combine the not selector. It's very similar to what we had just now, so that there is a way for you to opt out if you wanted to. But automatically, this is a behavior. So you import a module, and then there's certain things that come with the module. And then you sometimes just use it without realizing that it exists this way. So that's how they do it. Just specify the selector a bit more powerful. Yeah, powerful. So we always familiar with this attribute selector. Is when you wanted to use an attribute, you just introduce a new kind of attribute. Is it like attribute selector? And then it's how we see it on the example. It's like you do a focus or something, but then it's not the only way you can write directive. Directive in general is like to enrich the functionality of a native element or the existing component. So you can specify the directive in the way that you wanted to do it. And talking about the directive context and all, it's going to be another half an hour, so I will not jump into it. But that's the idea, after all. So the takeaway from the talk, I think that's all. Yeah, that's the takeaway for all the things I've been mentioning. So the first one is augmenting the native element can make the implementation reduce the complexity of the implementation. Also provide a familiar API and ensure the accessibility. And we use the augmenting by utilizing the attribute selector. Let me see. So that, there's a greater or equal. So usually it could bring more value instead of just introducing new custom component all the time. And the last one, when you think about the Angular selector, the thing on the decorator, say direct selector, think about CS selector because it can match a lot of stuff. Really, it's more or less, it's kind of work just like jQuery. You say, oh, I have this $sign of something, and then when it's matched, you add a certain functionality. I think directive is work kind of the same thing, but it's doing it automatically for you. And I think we come to an end. Grazie mille! Woo!
All right,
It is not all. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.